Hello. Okay, hello, good morning.
Morning.
Okay, let's see how many of you are there. 5 so far. Let's wait a bit and then we proceed. Yes. Not now, thanks, later. Later, not now.
Oh, later. Okay. Sorry, this one on, this one I lock. You will lock on this one on.
Okay. Okay.
This one on, sorry. Sir, window open.
Window.
Yeah, can open.
All right.
This one go, go. Okay. What this one? No, this one. Yeah.
All right.
This one open. Open. No. Oh, this one. Yeah. Now go out. Go out. No. Go water come in.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Morning, Professor.
Morning. How are you? Sorry, I'm at the hotel because we're moving, and in the meanwhile we're staying at the hotel.
Oh, that's a very, very nice thing.
What?
Is the hotel very comfortable?
So, and it could be worse. So, let's wait 2 more minutes because I see that only half of you are here. In fact, not even half.
Ah, how's the breakfast at the hotel?
I don't know because I don't take breakfast. I take only a bit of coffee in the morning.
Hmm. But don't the hotels offer complimentary breakfast?
Oh yeah, they do, but I didn't go down for that, so I just asked for a bit of coffee. Oh,
So, Professor, I think some of us are a bit confused about like the chapter layout. So, by each chapter, you mean each paragraph, right?
yeah, but those are called chapters. Uh, what you see divided by numbers, each number represents a chapter. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, down to 11, I think. In the treatise is 11 chapters.
Hmm. And also for this lecture, we have to have read the other document you have sent, right, regarding EDOS.
What again?
So we have to. So regarding EDOS in the other file that you sent,
Mm-hmm.
the EDOS is supposed to be the one thing that remains central to a thing's being,
Well, we'll discuss all this later on. For now, I've
or
sent
the
you
essence
the
of
document,
something.
yeah, so that you start familiarizing with certain key concepts. But we'll discuss these things as we go.
Okay.
Okay, let's wait a bit more. Okay, almost there. Just wait 1 minute.
In class. Morning,
Okay.
Prof.
Morning.
Prof.
Okay, 28. It should be in total 31 because it's 30 of you plus 1 me, so it should be 31. Let's wait 1 more minute.
Yeah, I guess. I didn't turn off last night.
Okay, let's start because it doesn't seem that anybody else is coming. All right, so let's first get organized as for today's class. We said that we were going to first listen to your questions, some of which I bet are practical questions. That is to say, they have to do with how to read the text or even something more practical relating to the organization of the course per se. So first we're going to do that, listen to your questions. Then we're going to clarify the title of the course, namely the question of being. And after that, if time is left, we'll start going into the text itself. Okay? Are we in agreement? Hello? Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Oh, no. Oh, he's there.
Can you hear me?
Yes, now I can hear you.
Yes.
Okay, I don't know what happened. I mean, Zoom stopped working all of a sudden. Well, did you hear what I said regarding how we're going to organize today's class?
Yes.
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, good. So I leave the floor for your questions first.
I do not think we have questions.
Oh, I have one question.
Okay.
Okay, so in the previous lecture, you mentioned how the consequences or the impacts of one philosopher's thinking can only be seen very far into the future. So it's the same with Plotinus' work, which did not leave a large impression during his time, but over time, as the philosophers grappled with his ideas, then an understanding of him emerged which shaped society today. And you say it's the same regarding Plato's thought and how the current society is pretty much the Western world. So how do you know which philosopher's thought is the most instrumental in shaping our society today? And can the same understanding be used to understand the philosophies of different cultures? So say I want to look at which Chinese philosopher has the greatest impact on China today.
Okay, first of all, let's clarify the term philosophy and philosopher because that's a quite ambiguous term that in our common parlance is used in a rather imprecise way. Philosophy and philosopher, the term, refer to a very specific way of organizing thought. Now, I hope that all of you agree with me that every human being, insofar as it is a human being, thinks. Okay? Thinking is the characteristic of the human being. However, there are ways of thinking which shape thinking in different manners. Philosophy is a specific way of organizing thought, and this specific way emerges in Greece at a certain period of Greek history, namely around the 6th century BC, more or less. What about what we call Chinese philosophy, Indian philosophy? Well, those are not philosophies. Those are different paths of thought. How are we to characterize them? I don't know. I'm not an expert in Chinese traditional thought or in Indian traditional thought. For sure, they're not philosophies. So, what is it that characterizes philosophy? Again, in the way in which we use the term vulgarly, so to say, the term comes to mean something like a certain way of seeing things. Think of the expression, my philosophy is that blah, 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 blah. Or the philosophy of such and such culture is this and that. In these expressions, the word philosophy means view, or if you prefer, way of taking things, or approach to things. And of course, what is implied in this way of understanding philosophy is that philosophy as a way of seeing things is something that in a way comes about not necessarily as a result of an explicit reflection on what one says and what one thinks, and in fact on what one does. The characteristic, though, of philosophy as a particular way of thinking is precisely that. An explicit interrogation, hence an explicit reflection on what one says, on what one does, and on what one thinks. And one of the most immediate and evident effects of this characteristic of philosophy is the fact that when it emerged, it subverted the way of thinking, ways of thinking that were typical of the culture in which it emerged. Namely, when philosophy emerged, it caused... I hear does someone want to say something?
Guys, can you like mute your mics?
What?
Mute their mic.
No, that was Sean. Sean had a mute.
Sorry. I'm so sorry.
So I was saying, when philosophy emerged, it emerged in such a way that it put into question explicitly all the practices, mark my words, all the practices, all the beliefs, all the assumptions, all the traditions of the culture in which it emerged, namely ancient Greek culture. So much so that philosophers were from the start perceived by common people as, at best, eccentric persons, at worst, as a public danger. In fact, the most prominent figure among the philosophers in ancient times, namely Socrates. He was put to death. If you go read the accusation labeled against Socrates, and if you know how to read it from within Greek mentality, then you see that that accusation says exactly what I'm saying. What did the Athenians accuse Socrates of? They accused him of pushing away the gods of the city, introducing new gods, and hence corrupting the youth. What does this accusation say? This accusation says, if you know how to read it properly, that is to say, putting yourself in the shoes of an ancient man, this accusation says, you are pushing away the tenets that keep together the fabric of our society. And you are introducing new principles. And in doing so, you corrupt the youth. Okay? So, philosophy is a very particular way of thinking. Very, very particular. Now I see that William has raised his hand. I'll let him speak.
Yes, thank you, Prof.
What?
Okay, sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. So going on from Tuesday's discussion on the hermeneutical approach, my understanding was that empathy of the author and what he was thinking when he was writing helps in enhancing our understanding of the text. So I'm just curious, in the case of Plotinus, right, were there any other events going on in his life aside from the struggles which you mentioned, which might actually help enhance our understanding? Like, for example, I mean, using a very simple example, maybe he got jilted by someone, maybe he's going through something difficult. Just as more like just trying to explore on an idea. Thank you.
Okay, so before I get to your question, let me finish what I'm saying, answering C's question, otherwise we get confused. So that's what philosophy is. And in this sense, one cannot talk about Chinese philosophy or Indian philosophy or Germanic philosophy, by Germanic meaning the philosophy of the ancient Germanic tribes. No such thing exists. It would be as absurd as talking of the sacred book of the Chinese. Did the Chinese have a sacred book such as the Bible? No, they didn't. It means that the Chinese are stupider than the Jews? No, it just means that the Chinese didn't have a sacred book. That's it. So the Chinese never had philosophy. The Japanese never had philosophy. But also the ancient Germanic tribes never had philosophy until they met the Greeks. The Romans never had philosophy until again they met the Greeks. So philosophy is a Greek phenomenon that then permeates the totality of what we call Western civilization. That's first clarification. Second clarification, the effect of a thought on society. If we put it this way, it seems that society is the result of a series of thoughts, ideas, conceptions that then come together to shape it, to shape society. Well, a simple observation will tell us that that's not the case. Societies existed before any kind of formalized thought came about. Chinese civilization, albeit in a primitive form, existed centuries before Confucius. Indian civilization, again, albeit in a primitive form, existed centuries before the Vedas or before the Upanishads. In the same way, Greek civilization, albeit in a form that is alien to us now, existed centuries before philosophy emerged. So thought of any sort, philosophical or not philosophical, does not shape society. How does society emerge? Human society. Well, that's another story. That's another story that philosophers have also investigated, so I won't get there.
And what about a certain way of thinking? Because in your previous course, you mentioned how technique became the predominant way in which we thought about.
All right. So, a certain way of thinking. A certain way of thinking, and if we take for an example, the way in which we are steeped, by we I mean the modern men, a certain way of thinking emerges slowly throughout the centuries, and as a result of a certain way that grows on itself, of a certain way to look at things. Let's ask this simple question, which is a question that you can hear asked also by other people. For example, Neil Ferguson, or what's the name of that other American or British author who wrote Gun, Steel, Germs, or something like that, Bacteria, Germ, Bacteria, Steel, something like that. The question is, how come that it was the West that colonized the rest of the planet and it wasn't the Chinese? Or put in other terms, how come that the world in which we live is fundamentally a Western world? How come that the West has been able to make this technological, political, societal jump in which we all live? In order to understand this question, you must have in front of your eyes, in a clear way, the phenomenon in which you yourselves live, namely the fact that, as I told you many times, every person who lives in what we call the modern world is a European, consciously or unconsciously. Most of us unconsciously. Is this fact clear in front of you? If this fact is clear, the question that you should have is, how come that I, a Chinese, descendant of Chinese, how come that now I'm closer now, culturally, to a European who lived 200 years ago, rather than to my Chinese ancestors? I hope you have this fact in front of you clearly. It is, when you think of it, a curious fact. A fact that someone born, say, in New Delhi today, and being educated to become an engineer, and becoming, in fact, an engineer, the fact that this person is way closer to, say, Edison, or to, you name it, Newton, than he is to any Indian wise men who lived 200-300 years ago. This is a fact. This means that this person born in New Delhi 20 years ago, is a European, is a Westerner, who happens to be born in New Delhi, and who happens to speak also Hindi, but is a Westerner. Do you have this fact in front of you? Let me see.
Hi, Prof.
Yes.
I do have a question when you define Westerner. I think it's definitely we can assure that like a Western influence, Western do has a bigger influence in the modern world. But if you actually name someone who born in New Delhi, have a good knowledge of Newton's physics, Einstein's physics and maybe the Western science and technologies to be a Westerner. I think, is it over defining the name of Westerner?
Well, the point of being a Western doesn't mean that you have a good knowledge of Einstein and company. It means that you look at the world in a way that is Westerner. In other words, an Indian who was born 150 years ago in New Delhi, how would he have understood himself and things around himself? Well, surely he wouldn't have gotten an engineering degree because his aim in life was not that of getting a condo. His aim in life was that to maybe get married, produce children, and then, after a certain age, go live in the forest like a wise man. Or from the beginning, his aim in life, the definition of what human life is, would have been to become a wise man, and hence to become a guru. And when you ask them, what is the truth of things, he would have told you that things are the breath of Brahma. Which doesn't mean that he actually thought that some kind of big guy there, through his breath, keeps things up. What he meant is that things are what keeps itself alive through the livelihood that goes around everything. And hence my relation to it is that of a part to a whole, and so on and so forth. If you want to have a clear example of something that is not yet assimilated to this all-encompassing Western world, look at, in a certain way, the Muslim world. What we call Muslim fanaticism is, or Islamism, is in many cases a conscious attempt to resist the westernization of Islam. Okay? Now, someone who's completely westernized doesn't need to know Newton, because very few people in the West know Newton. If you go ask my cousin, who is a lawyer, and you tell him, oh, do you know the theory of relativity? Well, he has heard it in school, but that's it. He's a Westerner not because he knows Einstein. He's a Westerner because he approaches life in a certain way. So what we have to understand is the way in which the West approaches life. And what is this way? Well, it's a way in which we are steeped day in, day out. What is the sense, the meaning, the truth of things for a Western mind, for the Western mind? What are things for the Western mind? To answer this question, just look at the way you manage your lives. How are you managing your lives? What is it that you're doing?
That you manage every aspect of it like you are some sort of machine.
Yeah, but I mean, without jumping already to that, which is the conclusion of a more distanced outlook on ourselves, what is it that we do?
You try to take measure of yourself at every situation relative to others.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's something still too vague, but look concretely what you do with your lives.
I think now we approach our life in a way, compared to the older people, we approach our life more scientifically. That means that we try to improve our life based on empirical facts instead of praying to God. I think that's I mean, we still pray to God to improve a lot of us still pray to God to improve hoping to improve our life. But we approach our life fundamentally through scientific empirical findings or scientific theories to actually to have a more desirable life that we think we should have.
Okay, so
is that right?
In your answer, there are there emerge the signs of one deep confusion that is steeped in the way in which, above all here in Asia, you people think about what modernity does. It's something that now is spreading also in the West as ignorance advances among the various social classes. What is this confusion? The idea that science is the result of the accumulation of empirical facts. What is the problem there? If I ask you what is an empirical fact, can you tell me what an empirical fact is?
Observable results, observable, measurable results, that and this result can be repeated based on the very fixed methodology.
So
then
is it the fact that if I put water on a stove top and I start the fire, the water will boil?
Yeah, technically, yes.
Can I repeat this thing many times?
Yes.
Does it make the act of cooking a scientific act?
No.
No, in no way. Because science is not based on empirical facts. So eliminate this word from your vocabulary, facts. Facts don't exist. The word fact is a fiction of language. There is no fact. If by fact you mean something that is the way it is, well, there are a few such things in our life. One is the fact that, for example, we were born. It is the way it is. I was born the way I am. Another thing that is the way it is the fact that all of us are going to die. And everything that now breathes, one day won't breathe anymore. Now, are these facts? Yes, if by fact you understand things that are the way they are. But things that are the way they are completely independent of us. I didn't decide to be born. And I didn't decide that at a certain point I was going to die. When instead it comes to what in the common acceptation, in the common parlance we call fact, like the so-called scientific empirical facts, those are not facts. Those are the result of a certain way in which the human being relates to a certain thing. Now, when it comes to science, what's the kernel of science? Observation? No. Measurement per se? No, not even that. Repetition of something that we've seen working? No.
Modeling?
Modeling. That is to say, throwing on things a certain model, this model being aimed at a certain result that I want to elicit from the thing. If I want a mountain to give me uranium, okay, I have to model my relation to the mountain in such a way as to force the mountain to give me uranium. And once I get this uranium, I have to create yet another model to force uranium to give me this and that. Where is the fact here in the sense as the already given? There is no such thing. Okay? So let's go back. What's the Western way of looking at things? Is a way whereby things are reduced to what is made. Now, mark my words, what is made to stand in front of us, and out of which, through a process of modeling, we extract value. That's why everything in the Western mentality becomes a resource. A thing is a resource only when it can be exploited, otherwise it's not a resource. But I hope you understand that all this is not based on facts, it's based on a certain approach. An approach that depends on the human being, after all. An approach in which the human being is implicated. Whereas someone who prays to God or to the gods doesn't see things as resources. He sees them as gifts. It's a completely different way of relating to things.
So, Professor,
Yeah.
if I repeat correctly, it's what is made to stand in front of us after a series of modeling appears to us as resources. Is that what you mean?
No, I mean, we start looking at it as a resource, and then we start constructing models in order to force this thing that now is reduced to a resource to yield to us what we wanted to yield to us.
Oh, so what is made to stand in front of us, we model in an attempt to make use of.
Yeah. Now, a simple word to say what is made to stand in front of us is the word object. Object means precisely that. Something that is made to stand in front of us. Objectum, something that is thrown in front. Thrown and set in front.
So in the sense that most of us are steeped in this subject-object duality, which is very prevalent, because we always say I, he, so on and so forth, is the foundation of this subject-object of the...
It's not the I, he, blah, 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 because the I, he is the way in which any language manages to distinguish me from you and so on and so forth. That's not the point. The point is that from a certain moment on in history, in the history of thought, and particularly in the history of Western thought, which is the thought that, as we said, conquered the world, conquered the planet, at a certain moment, the relation of the human being, not of me particularly, but of the human being to things, has been understood as the relation of a subject that as subject constitutes, creates almost, makes, establishes an object. That is to say, establishes what the thing is. And what is the core of an object? Being a resource. And as a resource, being submittable to modeling, and hence to measurement, and hence made to yield what I, in my predictive planning, have decided to extract from it. That's why for the Western mind, a mountain is primarily a resource of uranium or of marble. And you are primarily human resources. That is to say, resources out of which working force can be extracted for the next 35 years, or 45 in fact. Is that clear?
Yes.
Okay, can I
Prof.
clarify something? So, while I agree that the idea of objects as a thing to be extracted value out of is a thoroughly Western idea. I think the link between this being a scientific artifact of scientific thought might not be as explicit.
Yeah,
so
it's not an artifact of scientific thought. Then we must be careful. It's not an artifact of scientific thought. Scientific thought rests within this frame, this mind frame.
Because
what we call scientific thought is not based on empirical facts. What we call scientific thought is instead secretly, and secretly meaning not so evidently, steeped in this mentality in which, in order for me to approach things in a scientific way, I must have already have reduced them to objects.
Because, just to make that link clear, the only reason for quantifying or measuring, or the primary purpose behind it, would be to extract some form of utility, functionality out of said phenomenon, right?
Precisely.
And lacking this worldview of...
Prof, I have a question. So just now you said that the Muslim...
Let's finish, Joel, otherwise we get...
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, outside of this process of prediction, or sorry, out of this process of functionality, there would be no reason for prediction in the first place.
Precisely.
Okay.
Yes. Someone else wanted to say something?
Gerald?
Oh yeah, hi. Yep.
Yeah.
So earlier you mentioned that, the Muslims don't really have this Western way of thinking. So maybe could you do a contrast of like how the Muslim actually have this have a certain specified different way of thinking, because you said that they don't really they're trying to actively resist the Western perspective of looking at things.
Well, sorry a second. No, sorry. Sorry, not yet. No, later on. I need to do something.
Later, what time?
I don't know, half an hour from now. 30 minutes. No. No, 30 minutes. I need 30 minutes more.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Sorry, guys. The Muslims, yeah. Well, now it would be difficult to, in a few words, talk about Islam, right? Islam is, together with Christianity, part of the offspring of Judaism, as I hope you know. And if we want to think Islam, somehow we must, as the same way if we want to think Christianity, we must interrogate ourselves about Judaism. And it's not an easy question, right? What is the kernel of this human experience? Well, the kernel of it is the relation to the divine, and particularly the divine understood as a personal principle. The God of the Jews, of the Christians, and of Muslims is a personal God. When I, as a Christian, pray to God, I pray to someone that I believe listens to me. And this someone has a plan for me, a plan that I believe is based on love. The same thing when a Muslim prays to God, and by the way, Allah means just God. Okay, so I as a Christian and a Muslim, we believe in the same God. When a Muslim prays to Allah, he prays with the same understanding that I pray with. That is to say, I'm talking to God, and God is this infinite, almighty, all good someone who wants only my best. This is to put things in a very simple way. Now, as I was telling you the other day, when something like this emerges, the wrong approach is to say, oh, this person thinks that this and this is the case. No, it's not that this person thinks. This person somehow, or this culture somehow, has grasped things from within this insight. Where does this insight come from? That's mysterious. But as an insight, is very concrete. Is just as concrete as the insight that you love someone and you're loved by this someone. The Chinese instead had another insight. The Chinese didn't think of divinity in this way. They thought of it in another way. But again, this thinking, when I say thinking, doesn't mean that the Chinese sat around and talked about, oh, what is the nature of divinity and blah, 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 blah. No. The Chinese were struck by a certain insight. And around that insight, they grew as Chinese. Same thing for the Indians and so on and so forth. Now, what is the kernel of the insight on which Judaism, Christianity, Islam are based? A certain relation to the divine. But if I say certain relation to the divine, is very vague, because certain doesn't define anything. Am I able now to define that relation? Not really. It's a difficult question, as I told you. Very difficult question. In any case, if we look at some of the things that what we call Muslim fanatics say today, we can get a grasp of how these people are standing for the in a way I want to say protection or
conservation
or preserving of a certain way of looking things. So what is it, for example, that someone who embraces radical Islam goes against? Well, the idea, the notion that you are the owner and the master of your life. A radical Muslim will tell you, no, you're not the master of your life. God is the master of your life. And you must listen to God. So the point is not doing what you want to do. The point is doing God's commands. Is in this sense a radical Muslim different from, say, a radical Christian or a radical Jew? No. If you ask, I mean, I have friends who are radical Catholics. If you ask them, one's life is meant to be in agreement with the laws of God. And the laws of God are expressed by the laws of the church. So you have to do certain things steadily and constantly. Same thing if you ask a radical Jew. What makes the difference there between the modern mentality of the Western world, above all as it emerged in the past, say, 400 or 500 years, and the mentality of the ancient Abrahamic faith, that is to say, of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam? Well, the main difference is that for those ancient faiths, man is not the one that decides what things are or are not. God is the one who decides. And hence, whatever you encounter is not your property. It's not for you to use as you please. It's not for you to plan on. Whatever you encounter is something you're entrusted with by God as God's property. And if it is God's property and you must preserve it, then you must understand what this property is meant to be. And what is meant to be does not depend on you. It depends on the one who made it. And who is it who made it? Again, God. Now, one could say that between the, let's call it, Jewish way of understanding the nature of divinity and our relation to it, and the development of modern Western mentality, there is a tight link, a link of dependency. In many ways, modern Western mentality is a result of the Judeo-Christian way to look at things, mixed with the Greek way to look at things. But that's another story, okay? In any case, the point that I want you to be clear about is that we live, all of us today, in the Western world, and living in the Western world means that we approach things in a certain way. And what you must do first, in order to understand what we're going to do throughout this course, is to have clearly in mind this fact. Because it is starting from this fact that we're going to read Plotinus. What we're going to look for in Plotinus is a piece of the puzzle that forms the Western world in which we live. The kind of mentality in which we are, the Western mentality, has come into being through centuries of thought accumulation. We must, first of all, have clearly in mind the puzzle we're looking at before we go look at the various pieces of it. Okay? So in a way, and now I conclude my answer, my long answer, maybe too long-winded to C's question. In a way, studying a text such as the one we are studying now is a manner to try to look with some kind of clarity at the step or steps that have brought us this far. But in order for us to do that, we must be clear regarding where we are. If we're not clear about that, we can't pose the right questions. And if we can't pose the right questions, we just go around like headless chickens. Okay? So, does a philosophy have an effect? Yes, it does. But it's an effect that works like an underground river. You don't see it. And yet, it is thanks to that river that vegetation prospers up above. We must understand, first of all, what kind of vegetation we're dealing with in order to then understand the nature of this river beneath, and in order to trace the way in which this river runs. The important thing that I want you to grasp is that what we're doing is not some kind of historiographical collection of curiosities regarding opinions uttered by men who died 2,000 years ago. What we're doing has to do directly with the possibility to understand in a deeper manner the world in which we live, in which you are steeped. To understand in a deeper manner why at the end of the semester I have to put a number on each of you. which when you think of it is an absurd thing. Okay, now let's go to William's question. And William was asking regarding how to read, how to try to understand Plotinus, whether developing some kind of empathy to the author can help us understand Plotinus. Well, how shall I put it? I would say that this is the wrong approach, not only for Plotinus or for philosophy, but in general, for anything. When one reads a text, one must read a text. That is to say, the author as a person should not be considered. What you're dealing with in a real text is the text. That is to say, the ideas, the views, the insights, and their concatenation expressed in the text. Now, how do you read a text properly? By following it religiously. That is to say, by trying to understand, to penetrate as much as possible the concatenation of thoughts and how the text is built. Okay? This might not come so easily. You have to look carefully in order to find what's the actual core of what is being thought. But in order for me to give you a hint at the actual core of what is being thought, let me tell you a phrase that you must be looking at. Okay. So if you go to chapter if you go to chapter 7, okay, chapter 7, give me a second, I look it up also on my commentary that I sent you, chapter 7. Yeah, you go look at chapter 7, towards the end of it, you find that Plotinus says this sentence. In Greek it sounds, το γαρ ποιήν ineti idoses την ποιήν. Making something be means to make an ethos. This sentence is probably the most central sentence of this entire treatise. How did I find it? Well, by reading it carefully many, many times, by reading the treatise carefully many, many times, and finally picking it up, and after that, starting to reconnect this sentence to all the other insights I'd had already in my previous readings of this treatise and of other treatises of Plotinus. So you don't need to know anything about Plotinus as a person. You don't need to know anything about his taste, also because we know very little about him, very, very little. And in fact, this is just a curiosity, Plotinus himself seems to have been aware of the fact that the author has to efface himself. In fact, in the life of Plotinus written by his disciple Porphyry, Porphyry says that Plotinus was very, 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 very careful not to talk about himself. The life of Plotinus that we have tells us of what Porphyry himself has seen living with the guy. But as of Plotinus's previous life, Porphyry knew near to nothing, except things that he could collect from others. Okay? All right, so any more question?
Okay, I have two questions. One question is, do you mind to repeat the phrase you just mentioned? Because I was trying to look for it and
Yeah.
in the conversation, then I lost the phrase.
Let me see in the English text, okay? So that is gonna be easier. Give me a second. Okay. Now in the English text. Okay. In the English text, the incriminated sentence appears
Wei-Min says
page 383, and in your English translation it says,
Wei-Min says lines 22 to 23.
Yeah, but that's in the Greek text. I want to find it in give me a second. Okay, your English text says, for creating is bringing a form into being. Which is a completely wrong translation. Completely wrong. And is wrong at various levels. First of all, because it uses the word create, whereas the Greek uses the word pio. Pio, pin in the text because it's the infinitive. The verb pio in Greek means to make. Okay? And in fact, if you go read the Greek Bible, God is not said to have created. God is said to have made. En archi episen o theos uranon kehin. In the beginning, God made the sky and the earth.
How do we differentiate the two?
You have to look at what they say. The verb pio is a Greek verb, is a Greek word out of which the word poet, for example, comes. The word poetic, and so on and so forth. And it means to make, literally to make. For the ancient Greeks, an architect or an artisan of sort is a pietis, is someone who makes, is a maker. The word create instead comes from Latin, creo, from the verb creo, creare. And creo in Latin is connected to the word cresco, which means I grow. So someone who creates is someone who helps growing. Is someone who raises. It's two different things, completely two different things. So this translation is wrong, starting from the words it uses, okay? And also because your translation says again, let's read again. For creating, which translates togarpin, is bringing a form into being. So if you read your translation is reading the Greek text as if the Greek text is saying, togarpin idos estin pin. Is jumping, is skipping over the ineti. But the Greek text says, but making something t, ine, be, making something be, making something exist, is, esti, pin ethos, is to make an ethos. Do you see the difference? The meaning is overall completely different. The Greek text is saying that whatever is, whatever exists, so a tree, a cloud, my foot, your face, or you yourself, your cat, and so on and so forth, whatever exists is an ethos, and an ethos is the result of some kind of making. That's what the Greek text is saying. Whereas the English translation says creating, and creating, God knows why, is equated to making. Creating is to bring an ethos into being, which doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean anything. Whereas Plotinus is absolutely crystal clear. Whatever exists is an ethos. An ethos is something made. The entire treatise is an attempt to explicate how an ethos is made, in which sense we can say that an ethos is something made. And in order to understand this explanation that runs through 15 pages, we must understand, first of all, what an ethos is. The answer that Plotinus gives to this question, in which sense is an ethos made, comes through the use of a keyword, theoria, which again in your English text is poorly translated as contemplation. A translation that also in that case is unphilosophical, bordering to nonsensical. Okay, so this is another long-winded answer to William's question. How do you read the text? Not taking into consideration the author. The author should disappear. Borges used to say that, in his opinion, the most fortunate author of all history was Homer. Why? Because about Homer, we know literally nothing. So what is left is just his work. And he continued saying, a real author, an author who's really an author, wishes to disappear in his work. Then, once you're in front of a text, how do you approach it? Well, you must try to disentangle it. And how do you disentangle it? By reading and rereading and rereading until you find that kernel that represents the central piece around which the whole thing is woven. Now, notice the words I used: disentangle, woven. I didn't use them by chance. I used them keeping in mind the meaning of the word text. text is another word that comes from Latin, textus. It means something that has been woven, like a fabric, like a carpet, like a rug. Okay? That's why the work, part of the work of the hermeneutical work is that of understanding the fabric of this thing that has been woven together. How does this fabric work? Okay, that's part of the hermeneutical work. Another part of the hermeneutical work is to situate yourself in relation to the text, starting from a question that urges you. That's why before I stressed the fact that you must understand that we are starting from an interrogation regarding the provenance of the way in which we, as Western men, as Western human beings, as Western humanity, look at the world. In order for that interrogation to be authentic, in order for that interrogation to be effective, we must understand clearly what is the way in which we Western men look at the world. Okay?
So, Professor, if the best kind of text is to be read without knowledge of who the author is, then I find it quite ironic that in the last lesson you spent about an hour going through Plotinus's life.
No, I didn't go through Plotinus's life. I told you I told you about the cultural situation in which he lived. And that is important to know because Plotinus was doing exactly the same thing that we're doing. Plotinus understood very clearly the kind of cultural and epochal, I would say, predicament in which he was. And he tried to give an answer to it. Starting from what? From the thought in which he had grown, namely Platonism. What is it that Plotinus saw clearly? He saw clearly that he was living at a time of passage, momentous passage. A passage that was threatening as passage to cancel out his understanding of the world, which was the understanding of the world of the ancient Greeks. And he tried to react to it. Well, reacting is not the right word. He tried to think it through. He tried to see what was getting lost in this passage of the ancient tradition representing the Greek way to look at things, and he tried to repropose it. That is why one thing that happens in this treatise is the opposition between the notion of making typical of Christianity and Judaism and the notion of making typical of Greek thought. And that's one of the reasons why the sentence, the phrase that I just highlighted to you is fundamental. No, chapter 7, yeah, not 11. Okay?
Related to that, does it mean that also you said that yesterday, last time, the phrase like Middle Platonism, Neoplatonism is like nonsensical categorization? Does it mean that Plotinus has no new idea, that everything that he's saying is just really what Plato was trying to say?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. Those divisions that I told you about before are the divisions that the so-called historians of philosophy have come up with. And as I said, I mean, they're useful only if your interest is creating boxes in which you put things, right? But I think that that kind of concern borders with idiocy. But in any case, what I would say regarding your question, that is to say whether Plotinus comes up with his own ideas or he just repeats Plato's ideas. Well, I think that one shouldn't put things in terms of originality or lack thereof. One should put things in terms of grasping an insight, and grasping an insight that another man has had is a fatiguing thing. Grasping an insight and then live in it. Shape your life around it. That's what Plotinus did. That's what every great thinker does. Now, has Plotinus come up with that insight himself? No. He himself says it. He couldn't formulate it. He had a feeling. The formulation came when he finally ran in the words of Plato as encountered through Ammonius, right? However, once Plotinus grasped the insight that Plato had 600 years before his life, Plotinus lived by it. And what it means, what does it mean that he lived by it? It means that Plotinus developed it. He made certain things more explicit. Bergson once used to say that if you want to really understand Plato and Aristotle, you must read Plotinus, because Plotinus puts, as if under a magnifying lens, what in Plato and Aristotle remain details, but important details. Plotinus puts them under a microscope and forces you to see them large, so to say. Okay? Now I see that Joel has a question.
Yeah, so as far as I understand it, phenomenology is emphasis is on experience, and particularly bona fide experience and consciousness. There must be some form of seeing something. So my question is, does this conflict or exclude more cultures or works written by a collective whole? So, for example, the ancient Hebrew culture and Torah is largely oral accounts from multiple sources and oral tradition, where authorship may or may not be in dispute, and then a collection put together in writing. So, in these cases, I would argue that collective experience is somewhat different from an individual consciousness. Right?
Oh,
so,
I see. I see.
Is there a difference in the way that phenomenology works for these kinds of?
No, because can we really say that phenomenology cannot be applied, for example, to pre-philosophical Greek thought? No, we can't say that. That is to say, I can read, for example, something that occurred to me the other day. I can read a poem of the ancient Greek poet Simonides, who lived when philosophy started moving the first steps, okay? And in his poems, he repeats formulas that can be understood by everybody, because in many ways, those formulas repeat the common understanding of things. So one could say, oh, Simonides doesn't really express anything personal. He's just an amplifier of the common understanding. Yet, by trying to understand what lurks beneath those words in terms of insight that given people, that given group of human beings was riding on, you are doing phenomenological work. So when, for example, the Bible talks about the prophets, you know, the word for prophet in Hebrew is nabi. Nabi means both the cold and the color. What kind of insight lurks there? There is something that lurks there, and is not necessarily linked to a personal experience. In fact, this very notion of personal is partially a result of the latest part of modernity. Okay.
So basically you're saying that these kinds of experiences or insight, whether collective or individual, remains insight nonetheless. It doesn't get diluted by however many. Okay.
Yeah. Now there is a practical question. You spend some time on the courses itself. Like, what is the expectation from the exams, assignments, and quizzes? Okay, so let's now close the theoretical part, and I'll spend just 2 minutes on the practical things, and then I'll let you go. In terms of assignments, or let's say exams, we're going to have only 2 kinds of exams. So forget about the quizzes, because reading just one text, there is very little to quiz about, right? And plus, it would be quite difficult to run quizzes online. At least I'm incapable to do it. So as for the class, as for the exams, we're going to have 1 oral exam. And in the oral exam, you must make sure, you must show that you are capable of talking proficiently about what you're asked. And you're going to be asked only about the text that we're reading, not about something else. The oral exam itself will last 10, 15 minutes, depending on how it goes. And then there is an open-end questionnaire. And then there is going to be an essay at the end of the course as final exam. An essay that is going to be 1,000 or 1,500, 2,000 words long, and it's going to consist on an answer to a given question. Okay, I'll give you a set of questions, and you can choose 1 question out of 5 or 6, and on that question build your essay. As for the rest, what I ask you to do during the semester is to read the text many times religiously, really religiously, and to try to come to class every time with some kind of question regarding the text and regarding what has been said in class the previous time. Okay, that's all.
Will the final exam be the take-home assignment, or will it be live?
Home assignment. So I'll give you the questions maybe 2 weeks before, so that you'll have 2 weeks to write your essay. And you know, given the fact that your essay is 2,000 words, I think that 2 weeks is enough. Okay. All right. So I'll let you go now to your other destinations, also because they're kicking me out of the room to clean. And I'll see you next week.
Okay.
Thank you, bro.
Thank you, bro.
Thank you, bro.
Okay, bye-bye.
Good weekend. Bye-bye.
Bye.